Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Horseman, data evangelist with DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Bob's topic du jour is how and why to conduct a data asset inventory. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you would like to chat with us or chat with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, the Zoom chat defaults to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to network with everyone. For questions, we will be collecting them by the Q&A section. To find the chat and the Q&A panels, you'll see the icons for those features in the bottom middle of your screen. As always, we will follow up with an email within a couple of business days containing links to the slides, a recording of this session, and any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for the series, Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of KIK Consulting and Educational Services and the publisher emeritus of the Data Administration newsletter, tdan.com. Bob was recently awarded the DAMA Professional Award for significant and demonstrable contributions to the data management industry. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. And with that, let me pass the floor over to my good friend Bob Seiner to start his presentation. Hello and welcome, Bob.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can.
It's always good to do a check of that because, otherwise I'm just talking to myself, which would be no different from any other day. Boy, Mark,
Uh,
you do such a great job of making my introduction interesting for people. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your schedules to attend this, whether you're listening to this live or whether you're watching the recording of this that you will get within 2 business days of after the webinar. This is another great topic. I mean, Mark and I were talking about this before the webinar, that a lot of the topics that we address in this webinar series and through a lot of the other webinar series and presentations that are done at DataVersity are foundational topics. It seems like any topic that's is old is new again, and they just seem to keep coming up. So we're going to talk today about data asset inventories. We're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, metadata management. We're going to talk about basically, as Mark said, how and why to conduct a data asset inventory. But before we get started, just wanted to kind of share with you that this is the 159th episode, if you can believe it or not, 159th episode of the Real World Data Governance webinar series with DataVersity. And that image right there, just think about all of the different types of data that you have in different parts of your organization. And the fact that, eventually there's going to be a need for you to govern all of those different types of data. So we're going to talk about, well, first thing we need to do is identify what data we have, identify who's responsible for it. So actually, as I was also sharing with Mark before the session, the name of this webinar is incorrect. Instead of it being how and why to conduct a data asset inventory, instead, what we're going to do is we're going to reverse the order of those. We're going to first start out by talking about why it's important, what the value is that comes from having a substantial data asset inventory within your organization. And then we're going to start to walk through the hows. What are some of the steps? What are some of the tools? And eventually at the end of the webinar, I hope to get to the point where I talk about, or I have time left to talk about some examples of organizations that have developed use cases and data governance use cases around the use of a data asset inventory. So without further ado, let me just kind of touch on what I always touch on before the webinar starts, is just give you a quick introduction of myself. If you're not familiar with me, this monthly webinar series has been taking place since 2012. And next month, it's always on the third Thursday of the month. And next month, on the third Thursday of the month, we're going to talk about using glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs to drive data quality across the organization or across the enterprise. And again, it's another one of those foundational topics, because if you're not thinking about collecting your metadata and managing your metadata, you probably will be, or you should be at some point soon. And if you're not looking to use those things to drive quality across the enterprise, I think you'll be looking to do that as well some point in the near future. So that's about the real world data governance webinar series. Hope to see you next month. I will also be speaking in, and I can't believe it's just a couple of weeks away, in Anaheim, California, DATAVERSITY's annual event, the Enterprise Data World event that is co-located with the DGIQ conference. And I will be speaking on the Monday of that event. I'm doing a tutorial. I'll be sharing some of the tools, templates, techniques around data governance frameworks, communication models, role models, and those types of things. So please come join us in Anaheim if you get a chance to catch that presentation. I talk a lot about non-invasive data governance, as Mark mentioned in the intro. There are a couple books that I have written on non-invasive data governance. The first one called Non-Invasive Data Governance. The second one strikes again because it can't strike again unless it has struck the first time. And I also have some learning plans available through DATAVERSITY. The name of my consulting company is KIK Consulting and Educational Services. And in my spare time, I am also a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University here in my hometown of Pittsburgh. The one thing that is not on this slide that I want to add to this slide, and this is really only new within the last couple of weeks to the last month, is that the third book on non-invasive data governance became available. It's called Non-Invasive Data Governance Unleashed, and it really focuses on the human aspect of data governance. It's all really about empowering people to govern data and to govern AI, because everybody's talking about AI. So we've got to consider AI and AI governance as well. All right, so enough about me. Let's talk about the subject at hand today. What are the things that I am going to go through? I haven't actually changed the title on all the slides, but think of it, we're going to talk about the why first. We're going to talk about the importance of having a data asset inventory and the importance specifically to your governing efforts around your data and information and your processes of your organization, and the importance of having that data asset inventory to your governance program. Then I want to walk through kind of a quick hit, because we only have a limited amount of time here, kind of a step-by-step process for going about conducting a data asset inventory. And if you're already conducting an asset inventory, you may want to compare steps or compare notes and see if the things that I'm suggesting are things that might be able to empower you to provide a more thorough data asset inventory. Then I'm going to talk about tools and techniques to streamline inventory management, align the efforts with your governance goals. And I always talk about aligning your governance goals with your business goals. Well, we need to make certain that we're aligning our inventory efforts with our governance goals. And then if there's time, I'm going to talk about some real world examples of effective inventories in different organizations. Before I get started, or before I start jumping into those 5 topics, I typically just spend a minute or so talking about definitions. My definition of data governance is worded quite strongly. When I say it's the execution and enforcement of authority over the data, that's cringeworthy to some people. It sounds like it's worded too strongly, but the truth is, no matter what approach you take to data governance, the government and the regulatory controllers, they're not coming to you and asking you to follow what they're saying. They're telling you you have to, and you need to execute and enforce authority over the data in order to be able to be successful in matching what the, for example, executive orders or what the regulatory controls are. So execution and enforcement of authority, worded strongly, but that's truly, at the end of the day, if you're going to govern, you can do it in a non-invasive way. You can do it in a top-down command and control way. But the bottom line is you need to execute and enforce authority over the data. I talk a lot about data stewards and data stewardship, and I say often that everybody in the organization that has a relationship to the data, if they're being held formally accountable for that data, or for that relationship to the data, they're a steward of the data. It's not something to opt into or opt out of. If you use sensitive data, you're expected to protect that sensitive data. And that's really what we're doing, is we're formalizing accountability for people's relationships to the data. And then my definition of data steward is it's one of those people in the organization, potentially everybody, who's being held formally accountable for their relationship to the data. I've got a couple other definitions I want to share with you as well. My definition of metadata, you've heard the definition about metadata, that it's data about data, but in very much in line with this webinar here, if that metadata, if that data about the data is not recorded somewhere, it's not going to improve the value in the business and the technical understanding of the data. So when I say it's data about data, I'm really saying it's that data, but it has to be recorded somewhere. And it has to be recorded in some type of a tool, at least to make it, if you're going to draw a data model on a napkin, that's not your best place to share your data model information with people. So it needs to be recorded in a tool. And then for a data asset, those things that we're inventorying, well, that's really up to your organization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, where there's different types of data assets. So part of the process is to identify those units of data, those types of data that you need to include within your data asset inventory. So let's just spend a second. I could have developed several slides that have information about what's on this slide. What are the types of data assets that require governance in your organization? And I don't want to read through them, but you can see there's the databases and tables, whether they're relational or some other format of data, spreadsheets, emails, everything that constitutes data within your organization, or is most valuable to your organization, is one of those assets that should be recorded in your data asset inventory. More and more these days, as organizations recognize that AI doesn't care where it gets its data from, whether it's structured data in your systems or it's unstructured or semi-structured data assets, and we've done webinars on those in the past as well, they still need to be included in your data asset inventory. Or should I say, as you're determining what the appropriate metadata is or what the appropriate data assets are to store in your inventory, you should at least be considering these types of data assets, or any of those data assets that require being managed and being governed. So what's the definition of a data asset inventory? I guess this is all leading to that. And so my definition is that it's a structured and continually maintained listing of the most critical data assets to your organization, whether they're structured or unstructured. So what's bolded there in blue, structured and continually maintained, is, if you create a list of if you build a list of your data assets, it's going to be a painting of a point in time, where if somebody adds a new data asset, creates a new spreadsheet, develops a new information system, or a new app that's containing data, there is a need for ongoing change management to that data asset inventory. So I'd say it's a structured way of managing that list, but it's also something that requires some level of governance around it, continually maintaining that list. And it serves, basically, as I talk through the rest of the webinar today, it serves as a foundational tool for data governance by enabling people to know what data exists within the organization. I'll share with you a whole bunch of different attributes of things that you might want to include within your data asset inventory, and I'll get to that here in a couple minutes. All right, so that was a big lead in to the topics that I want to touch on today. So the first thing, so as I said, I reversed the title or the name of the webinar, at least hypothetically, to why and how to conduct a data asset inventory. So I want to focus on the why first. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the importance of the data asset inventory to your governance program. And the first thing is that it establishes a foundation for formal accountability. And not only that, but in order to have that foundation for formal accountability, we can't yell over to John, hey, John, you're now accountable. Accountable for what? We need to manage, and we need to be able to identify those specific things that people within the organization are stewards of, that they're accountable for, either from an operational perspective, from a a subject area, or a functional area perspective. But really, the data asset inventory, it establishes that foundation. It enables risk management and regulatory compliance. It supports data quality, and everybody is talking about how to improve data quality these days. It drives better decision making, and it enables scalable and successful governance in your organization. So let's touch on each of those things here real quickly. Um, and so when I talk about the why, and I talk about establishing that foundation for formal accountability in your organization, the data asset inventory basically is used as your tool to identify who is responsible for what. And that's a big part of data governance, and it's certainly a big part of data stewardship, is to identify, or at least to link each of these valuable data assets to, and I cringe when I even use the word owner. I like to use the word steward more often, because ownership implies that it's their data and they can do with it what they want. But I understand that a lot of organizations use that term owner. We need to recognize who the people are in the organization that are the owners and the stewards of the different data assets, in order to better manage and maintain and to govern those assets across the organization. Having a data asset inventory reveals potentially where we can't figure out who the owner or the steward is, where there are unknown or there's unknown data or unknown ownership of that data that needs attention. Um, it helps to clarify the roles and relationships that already exist. And that's what I'm saying. Let's recognize, instead of assigning people to be owners and stewards of that data. So again, this inventory, depending on how elaborate you make it, can contain a whole lot of different types of metadata about those data assets, including who the owners and the stewards are. Knowing what data we have enables communication with accountable parties. It supports, any role-based forums and those types of things that you're trying to implement within your organization. I talk a lot about a data governance operating model, and within the operating model and within the inventory, you can link together, as it says in the first bullet point here, those people who have accountability and knowledge for the data to the actual data assets themselves. It enables risk management and regulatory compliance. And I have always stuck to the principle of you can't protect or govern those things in your organization that you don't even know exist. So the first thing that it does is it's having a data asset inventory initiative precipitates that identification and classification of your data assets within your organization. What is sensitive, what's confidential, what are the regulated data assets? It gives you the ability to be able to take those data assets and apply which policies, or at least list out which policies in terms of retention and privacy and access are associated with those data assets. It supports things, again, depending on how elaborate your data asset inventory is. It supports, audits by providing different lineage and ownership and use. If an auditor comes in and wants to know who is responsible for this asset, who uses this asset, how is it being used, it's nice to have that recorded within a formal tool or within a formal data asset inventory. We'll talk about tools here a little bit more in a couple of minutes. Another reason why a data asset inventory is important to data governance is that it really can help you to highlight that data that is most important, that data that really requires the highest level of governance. Since you have a data asset list, it'll enable you to prioritize that asset list, identify where there potentially are duplicates or conflicting data. It really basically becomes that backbone of resources, or should I say data resources within the organization that need to be governed. So it enables you to then target specific stewardship efforts at those key data assets as well. And again, depending on how elaborate your data asset inventory is, it'll give you the ability to track known issues and responsible parties for resolution through your data asset inventory. Drive better decisions. When people know where the data lives and they have a better understanding of that data and who to go to when they have a question, it drives business improvement as well. You can use the inventory to identify or to tag or to label what are your authoritative data sources or golden data sources. As I said before, if you have a thorough, well-kept, up-to-date data asset inventory, you can use it also to prevent redundant collections of data or eliminate reductions or duplications of data across your organization. So it certainly helps to drive better decision making and efficiency across the organization. And one of the last things that I just want to talk about here is the why to conduct a data asset inventory, because it ensures that governance can evolve as your organization grows. You don't need to go out and you don't have to be perfect the first time you create your data asset inventory. You don't even need to collect all the metadata that eventually you want to get to. But at some point right now, you're going to want to know what data you have, who's responsible for it, what policies it is directed to. And so all of those things can be included within a data asset inventory. All right, so we talked about the why, and I think it's relevant. It's pertinent to most people that are listening to this webinar, why it's important for you to know as an organization what data you have. I can't tell you how many times I've started working with an organization where they say the first thing is we don't even know what all data we have. We can't even begin to start talking about who's responsible for that data because we need to start by producing a data asset inventory. So I want to spend a couple of minutes here talking about a step-by-step process for conducting the data asset inventory. And there might be many more steps than the 5 that are listed here, but let's at least go through them because I think some of them are the most, or should I say the primary steps for conducting a data asset inventory. And the first thing is to define the scope of the inventory. What types of data assets are we going to inventory? Making certain that we don't try to just do this on our own and create a list of data within the organization. If we want to collect and report relevant information to people, if we want to activate our inventory and make it useful to people, we're going to need to engage the appropriate people across the organization. And then another step is the act of gathering and documenting the assets, validating and enriching the inventory. And as I mentioned a moment ago, trying to take that data asset inventory and making it more actionable within the organization, where it's not just a passive resource for people to tap into, where it really becomes an active part of what people do. So the first step of those 5 is to define the scope of the inventory. And there's different ways to do that. And so basically what you're trying to do is identify what data is going to be included in your inventory and why are you including that data within your inventory. So you can break it down by business area. That's one way. Again, if you're not trying to boil the ocean and eat the whole elephant at one time, you want to do it a bite at a time, you might start with a business area or a specific system or systems or certain processes within your organization to kind of narrow your scope of those things that are going to at least initially be included in your data asset inventory. I'll talk about this here a little bit more in a couple of minutes, why it's important to kind of build a consistent way to inventory your data assets. Come up with a template, something that you can share with people to collect all the data assets within their part of the organization. But you need to start somewhere. In fact, I get the question, if you don't have a data catalog, can you still do a data asset inventory? And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Just be consistent in the way that you collect the metadata. So therefore, when and if you do acquire a data catalog tool or something like that, you'll be successful in porting that information over into that repository or into that data catalog tool. Decide whether you're going to include just structured data within databases and columns and tables and analytics platforms, or you're going to also include unstructured data like records management, content management, document management, emails, or you're going to include both types of data. But when you're going to define the scope of your inventory, you're going to need to define what's in scope. And you're going to need to define whether you're including things like structured or unstructured or semi-structured data. Many organizations start by inventorying their structured assets. But again, like I said earlier, AI doesn't care if it's a structured or unstructured data asset. You might want to know what you have, and that might include spreadsheets, it might include dashboards or reports or those types of things. Um, define what qualifies as a data asset. I think that's what we're talking about here. That's structured, unstructured data. What types of things qualify as a data asset, and then prioritize them by the value, by the exposure that you're getting from a regulatory perspective, what type of impact they're having on your operations. And then the next step is going to be, once we know, we've defined what's going to be in the scope of our inventory, we'll need to start working with people to get the input and the validation as to what information do we need to know about those data assets to be contained within our data asset inventory. So as I said, the next appropriate step here is to engage the right people or engage the appropriate people. And by going through those data assets, you can ask the question of, who defines this, who produces this, who uses this data? And you'll notice that you're going to really be building a foundational data asset in itself that is there to support your data governance program. Because at some point in time, when you're doing impact analysis or anything similar to that, you're going to need to know who to reach out to, who's defining the data, who's producing it, and who's using it. So I always say, instead of assigning stakeholders, let's identify who the people are within the organization, who are the quote unquote owners of the data or the stewards, who have formal accountability for that data, who the subject matter experts are. Use whatever tools you have available to you within your organization, existing org charts, process maps, anything. Talk to the people within the business areas, activate them. People are always looking for ways to activate and engage data stewards. This may be one of the most appropriate ways, is to get them involved early in helping you to inventory the different data assets in your organization. But I don't think I've used the term data asset as many times in one presentation as I have here. So pardon me if they are repetitive. While you're engaging the right people, you can also clarify the roles, make sure that you know who is defining, producing, and using the data. And then, use other tools that you have available to you, like forums or meetings, bring people together to collaborate. And if you can help them to understand the value that is going to come, the earlier part of this webinar, the value that's going to come from having a data asset inventory, it may be something that you might see that the data asset inventory is really a catalyst to getting your data stewards to become engaged. So here's the part where we start talking about what specific information do we want to collect within our data asset inventory. So I say here, gather and document these data assets. Start by collecting the most meaningful metadata and information. And here's where I also mentioned before, where you might want to create a template or a form for people to go into and register or load or at least record information about their data assets. And you can do that using any tool that's available to you. Excel is a popular one, SharePoint, or even a data catalog tool if you have a data catalog tool. I'm going to provide to you a couple of lists of potential types of metadata that you'll want to include in your data asset inventory here in a second. But things like the name of the asset, the source system of the asset, the business purpose, the owner, the sensitivity. Again, populate the inventory. Use the people in your organization to help you to identify what the most important information is about each of those data assets. So I always suggest focus on the known and the important assets first, and don't let perfection get in the way of good enough. Don't aim for perfection. So let me just provide to you a couple lists here of additional fields or things that you might want to consider including within your data asset inventory. Data asset name, description, domain, owner, all of these types of things are pretty typical. And if you're going to get, if you obviously registered for this webinar, so you'll get a copy of the slides afterwards. You can certainly use these or create a list of your own of things that you would want to include within your data asset inventory. Here's some additional things: data quality status, data retention. Again, those policy references that I mentioned earlier. So while you're gathering and you're documenting your data assets, you're going to need to determine what are the most important pieces of data that you need to have about those data assets. And then the next process, once you have at least an initial cut on that information, that database, that spreadsheet, wherever you're storing your data asset inventory information, now you have at least a starting point to go back and improve the quality of it, validate the entries into it, fill in the missing pieces. But that's really what it takes to get started, is to engage stewards, stakeholders across the organization, be very specific in what information you want to collect about your data assets. I always suggest to my clients, don't overdo it with your initial ask. Let's just get a record of each of the data assets, and then get more personal with the people, get more human with the people in the organization, go out and meet with them and learn from them those things that the correct information to be able to enter into your data asset inventory. And then, as I said, once you have the information in the database or in the inventory asset itself, look for ways to be able to make that inventory actionable. Link it to policies, share the inventory through different search engines that you provide within the organization. Keep it active by, I have the word assigning ownership, but it really should be saying recognizing ownership in the people within the organization, and engage them, get them active in keeping this information up to date. If a system changes, if its purpose changes, somebody needs to make a change to the asset inventory to reflect whatever those changes are. So again, the intention here is to make these data assets, that make this inventory actionable to the organization. All right, I'm going to need to move a little bit faster here if we're going to leave time for questions at the end of the webinar. I want to talk about some tools and techniques that you might want to consider as you are managing the inventory. And I mentioned earlier that this is something that is sustainable. That is, that there's change management applied to, that you're keeping up to date within the organization. So we need to streamline that whole process of inventory and management and governance of the data asset inventory itself. And we can do that through a tool. We need to talk about ways to go about harvesting the metadata. I'll talk to you about, again, engaging the data stewards and getting them active in keeping the data asset inventory up to date. I talked a little bit already about standardizing the inventory template and maybe keeping it limited at the beginning, but then expanding it to include all the different information that's pertinent for you to truly govern and to manage to your data asset inventory. And then also, it's a requirement to have a kind of a periodic review cycle to make certain that the information in the data asset inventory isn't stale, it's being kept up to date. Somebody told me once that giving somebody incorrect metadata is even worse than giving them no metadata at all. I don't know. I guess that's a debatable subject, but you want to make certain that if you're putting the effort into building your data asset inventory, that you want to keep the thing up to date, and you want to make it relevant, and make it relevant to the people in the organization who are going to use it. So using some of these tools like Calibra, Alation, Informatica, Info.world, Atlan, I mean, there are so many data catalog tools that are available on the market. Perhaps a tool that you already have gives you the automated capability of being able to go out and discover what data assets you have. Automatically scan and index them from across the enterprise, take all of these steps, link assets to business terms and owners. All these things are typical functionality of a data catalog tool. And in fact, I would say that with all of these tools, one of the most basic functionality within a tool should be to help you to be able to maintain your data asset inventory. So again, if you collect it in spreadsheets, you want to be able to port that over to some place that is going to be a good, solid foundational holding place for that metadata, especially if people in your organization are going to be coming to expect this information and going to come to use this information. What are some of the harvesting techniques? This kind of brought me back to the days when I was a metadata repository administrator back in the corporate world, where I was constantly writing scripts and tools to extract metadata from systems and reports and things like that. Again, where there's a will, there's a way. That was one of my favorite statements back then. And I would use whatever tools I had available to me to read through whatever assets there were in the organization where I could then extract this specific metadata that I needed. So you could pull technical metadata, you can extract metadata from reports, you can build automated scripts to do these things. Just make certain to go back and check that the quality of these scripts that you've developed are working effectively for you. And then eventually you can take that metadata and then port it into your data catalog tool or your data inventory list, or wherever the place is that you're maintaining that metadata. I suggested before that having this kind of relates back to the whole actionable idea of the data asset inventory. And we need to empower the people within the business units to become contributors and maintainers of this information in the data asset inventory. So whatever we as data governance practitioners can do, or tool practitioners, or even data asset inventory practitioners can do to provide this capability for people in the organization to become involved in maintaining or entering information into your data asset inventory or keeping it up to date. So provide those self-service interfaces, customize fields based on the different roles that people have as they're engaging through this portal. If you have a portal, I have a client now who has spent a lot of time and effort to build their data inventory program and create an application that gave people access to the data within the organization. Again, tailoring it to the specific audience as to what do they want to see through your data asset inventory is a really important way of getting data stewards and data owners and just people who are users of data to feel like they're involved in your data asset inventory effort. And I mentioned before, standardizing those inventory templates. Whether you're creating it in Excel or a SharePoint or some other online form that you have, make it as easy as possible for people. I mentioned before, actually just limit the number of things that you're asking for your first cut of the data asset inventory. But even then, providing pick lists as to, well, what domains of data does this data asset pertain to? What systems is it in? What's the sensitivity level? Again, the goal here is to make it as simple as possible for the people who are going to help you, who are going to be engaged in your data asset inventory, to become your colleagues on this, to become your confidants and your partners in providing the most detailed and the most powerful data asset inventory that you can. Again, include columns for confidence level. I've talked about data confidence level in previous webinars that I've done as part of this series. So again, standardized inventory templates are a very important technique in streamlining your inventory management. And the last thing that I have to say about the tools and the techniques to streamline your management is make certain that you schedule periodic reviews of the data, of the metadata that you've collected within your inventory. And it means basically keeping your inventory alive through whatever means you have, scheduled updates and engagements through quarterly and biannual refreshes. Again, build this into the process of your organization, because if you don't have a process to keep your data asset inventory up to date, it can become stale day 2 of having that data asset inventory available. It could become stale an hour or two when somebody goes and makes a change, or there's a change to a system, or there's a new system added, or a new report generated, or a new spreadsheet that's being used that is not included within your inventory. So again, a periodic inventory review cycle is an important technique to keep your inventory active, keep it alive, keep it up to date and fresh. And the last thing that I want to talk about before I kind of walk through real quickly several examples of organizations that have built data asset inventories and have seen direct value from them. I want to make certain that we're aligning all these efforts, because it's going to be an effort to inventory the data assets of the organization, make sure that they align with the goals of your governance program. So the first thing is to connect the inventory to business value. That makes sense. You want to connect your data governance program to business value first, but then connect your inventory assets to that business value as well. Aligning it through the recognition of who the owners and the stewards of the data are, integrating the policies, using the insights that you can draw from your asset inventory to make decisions, to make governing decisions for your organization. And then the last thing in this section is to embed the inventory process into workflows instead of recreating all of your workflows. Certainly the goal is, again, to stay as non-invasive as you can. And what you really want to do is you want to get people in the organization to understand the business value that's going to come from having a complete data asset inventory. And like I said in many other webinars, that the data assets and the data inventory is not going to govern itself. It's going to require this effort to do it. So connect the inventory to the data assets, ensure that every asset that you have in your inventory is evaluated in some ways in terms of how it supports business priorities. I've had some clients who even said, well, if it doesn't match or it doesn't support a specific business priority, either we're not going to include it in the asset inventory or we're going to eliminate it as a data asset. I don't know how smart that is, but it gives you the opportunity, once you know what all your data assets are, to identify the business processes they're associated with, categorize them according to the impact that they have or the impact areas within the organization. You just want to make certain that as you're collecting your data asset, your data inventory assets, that you are linking it to those things, the reasons why, and the people, the stakeholders of which in the organization are receiving benefit and value from that asset. I always use the term recognize instead of assigning clear ownership and stewardship roles. In most cases, you may have a business owner or a technical owner or an IT owner, or you'll have people within your organization. I always say that you're not starting governance from scratch. There's already systems, there's already data assets, there's already people who are responsible for those assets. We just need to know what the assets are. We need to associate people who have knowledge about and responsibility for those assets within this inventory. So tagging each asset with a responsible owner is important, ensuring that the roles are aligned with the different business functions. And you're not, again, the concept of being non-invasive is that we're not going to go out and create all these new roles. We're going to recognize those people in the organization who already have responsibilities and formalize them, instead of making them feel as though we're handing them something that they never had before. Formalize the accountability by educating the owners and the stewards of what their responsibility is in terms of maintaining this inventory as an asset. Track the role acknowledgement. Use the inventory to identify roles and gaps. Where are there no owners? Where do we don't know who the stewards are of the data? We can do that as all part of the data asset inventory process. Integrate governance policy into your inventory process. Again, don't want to read through each of these. I really want to jump into the examples of organizations that have used data assets inventories as a way to help support and leverage their data governance program or build out their data governance program. But if we can integrate things that are being mandated on us and the policies that we're developing as a part of governance into the inventory process, that's going to be a benefit to that whole process of developing and maintaining a data asset inventory. And use the inventory to basically to gain insights, where now you've got this different type of data resource. What types of questions can we ask of this data resource? How can we see connections between different data assets? How do we map how data moves from one data asset into another data asset? All these things, we need to make our inventory a strategic tool and not just a passive data catalog in the organization. So use it to support quality improvements, share inventory dashboards that even show what assets we have and how many of them are being governed and who they're being governed by and what parts of the organization. Those are all ways to make the inventory a strategic tool for your organization. And then embed the inventory process into existing governance workflows. I always talk about how any process is a form of governance in itself. If we could embed the use of the definition, the production, the use of the data asset inventory into our processes and make it just part of what we do, it's going to be a lot less threatening and a lot less invasive to the organization. So the idea is to embed these inventory management process steps into the things that you do as an organization. And Mark, I'm losing my voice here, so I'm glad we're getting to the last section here for today. I want to spend a few minutes just kind of looking across organizations that I've worked with, organizations that have written about how they've used a data asset inventory to be successful in specific use cases, what the outcomes of those activities are. I want to talk about some examples from the healthcare industry, financial services, which is where data governance seems to have gotten its start. But certainly it's now in all these fields, in energy and utilities, in retail and in government. It's very difficult to govern that which you don't know that you have. I think that was one of the points I made in a LinkedIn post just a day before the webinar here is we need to inventory our data assets. We need to associate people and process and all these other things that I mentioned with these different data, with these different assets that we have listed within our asset inventory. So the first use case I wanted to share with you was from a healthcare institution. And as it is with many healthcare institutions, their goal is to improve access to critical data, whether it's patient data, research data across departments, while making certain that they're following the rules, the HIPAA regulations, just as an example. So what did they do? They said, first of all, we need to know what critical patient and research data assets we have within the organization. So they created an enterprise-wide data asset inventory to identify all of these types of data. Last thing I heard from them, they've expanded the search into, or expanded the reach of their inventory into all of the different, or at least more unstructured data assets that they have within the organization. And the results that they're already starting to see and that they want to see more of moving into the future is a reduction in data sources, a reduction in data assets due to the data duplication, increased confidence in the data, improved response, all those by just creating a list of the different data assets that are housed within the organization. In the financial services, an organization sought to gain control over what they were referring to as data sprawl. And by data sprawl, they meant the popping up of additional data resources across the organization. They created, they integrated their catalog with their data asset inventory. They integrated that into the workflows of the organization. And the result was they tried to streamline their data governance operations and improve reporting and enhance regulatory alignment. Another example, and again, I want to go through these quickly, and then Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if we have questions, is the energy and the utility industries. Many of them are needing to modernize, something like that, their efforts. And they realize that in order to do that, they need to have more information about the data assets. So they launched a company-wide data asset inventory focused on those things that were most important to the organization. And the result was that it enabled cleaner system integration, reduced delays because people knew where they needed to go to talk to the appropriate people about specific data assets. In the retail space, again, a different type of use case, but aimed to leverage the customer data that they had, the supply chain data, the inventory data, so that they can have real-time insights for the data. In order to do that, they needed to know what data assets they had so that they could be leveraged appropriately for that real-time insights. And the results was improved productivity, reduced return rates, all of these different things just by the mere fact that they knew what metadata they had They knew what data assets they had within the organization. And the last one I want to talk about is just a government example who created a data asset inventory or data inventory program because of some of the mandates that are being handed down to them for being transparent with data, for tracking data assets, for tracking collaboration across the organization. And they created a whole inventory program to inventory those data assets. And it's just was something that they knew they needed to do as a starting point. And what it did was it improved data consistency across the agency. It enabled them to do more with less. It enabled them to have a better grip on what all data assets, or at least what were the most important data assets to the organization. So I know I kind of sped up here a little bit at the end. I wanted to start by again talking about the why first before I got into the how. So I spent a few minutes talking about the importance of a data asset inventory to data governance. I went through kind of a step-by-step process for conducting an inventory. Went through some of the techniques and things that you might want to consider as you're streamlining the management of your inventory, the importance of aligning it with the governance goals. And then I wanted to share with you a couple of examples of how organizations have leveraged these types of tools in their organization. And Mark, my voice is going very quickly here. With that, I want to turn it over to you to see, do we have any questions today?
We've got tons of questions. There's
Oh,
probably
goody.
5 questions in here that could be their own webinar. Um,
Okay.
well, I have questions for you too, but I mean, we can talk whenever. How do you maintain the data asset inventory over time? Some data asset types, spreadsheets, report, etc., are routinely created at a frantic pace in most organizations by people distributed throughout the organization. I love this question.
Well, that's a great question because you need to be very intentional about it. So those people that are willy-nilly create, maybe not willy-nilly, maybe just creating these spreadsheets that they're using to make decisions, they need to understand that it's important that there is record of that asset. So I always say that these things will not create themselves, that they need to have, that you need to be intentional about it. So one of the ways to do it is to engage stewards that are already colleagues of yours, and engage your community of excellence, your community of practice around stewardship. First of all, get them excited about the need for the inventory, and then find those people in those parts of the organization that be will be willing participants, should I
Mhm.
say, in the data asset inventory process. It's not going to happen on its own. And you're right. When spreadsheets are just one example of data assets that are being created all the time. If there's no intentional effort to record information about those assets, it's not going to happen.
What is the best way to capture how the data is being used? How to track if the data is being used in a way that's aligned to the business purpose at the moment of creation? See, it's a whole other webinar there too.
Well, how much time do you have, Mark? Um, how data is being used. I think that what you can do is you can create scripts of questions that you can go into stakeholders, and you don't need to just basically ask that general question, well, how are you using your data, because there's a lot of different answers to that. But you might want to lead them towards certain answers. I mean, where do you send this data? Where do you get your data from? What are the outputs? I mean, there are intentional ways of asking questions of these people to get down to the root of how data is being used in your organization. Also, you may want to consider, well, what are the important pieces of metadata to collect in our data asset inventory that can represent how that data is being used? Again, I think that's another webinar for another day, Mark.
Yep, I think so.
Great questions, though.
Oh, it's fantastic. I almost want to skip ahead a bit because how much time do we have? 7 minutes left. I'm not wearing my glasses, so I couldn't see the time. Uh, would conducting a data asset inventory be a prerequisite to building a data catalog? Oh, I love this question.
Is it a prerequisite? Um, At the point where you get to where you're connecting any of the other metadata within the catalog to the specific data asset, then would say, yes, it would be a prerequisite to being able to do that. Because if you don't have an asset list and you don't have them recorded within your catalog, you're going to be hard pressed to connect them to anything, right? Because they're not there to be connected to. Is it a prerequisite? I think there's things that you can start in a lot of different ways with a data catalog. You could start associated with what are our domains of data. Who starting with your council or your steward, start by cataloging them. But I say when it gets to the point where the metadata within your data catalog is providing things like lineage, is providing things like accountability per data asset, yeah, I guess you could consider a data asset inventory as being kind of one of those first steps in implementing a data catalog. Again, another great question, and we could talk about that
Yes.
all day.
Well, and I'm a huge fan of the common data matrix that non-invasive data governance uses, and being able to capture those domains of data, like when in doubt, write it out. You have an opportunity to just document some stuff, right? Let's start writing it down and
It
go from
is, and
there.
it's the same concept because the common data matrix, if you're not familiar, go look in the in the non-invasive data governance books. The other name for the common data matrix is the inventory and accountability matrix.
Hmm.
So it's helping you, as you were mentioning, Mark, to define it by domain and by subdomain and what domains of data exist in what systems. Now you're starting to talk about the inventory. Maybe it's not just systems, maybe it's other data assets included as well. So I could see expanding on the common data matrix to kind of become the start of your data asset inventory.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. These next two questions I'm going to ask together because they're very related. Um, so hang on for a quick second here.
I'm not
We
going
have
anywhere.
somebody postulating. I wonder if there are any good logical data models out there for data asset inventories. Okay. And then another questioner asked regarding a data asset, many data governance aiming for programs like aim for like tracking critical data elements at a high level glance without necessarily specifying entity attribute and how that fits into metadata. I'm not entirely sure about that. Would your recommendation of conveying the due diligence to capture the data asset and metadata in a conceptual data model or logical data model with a bit more precision? So
Okay.
we're
Let me
talking, that's a lot of topics there. I think that's like two webinars, I think.
Well, let's kind of walk through that. So the idea of a logical data model for a data asset inventory, I'm guessing that it's been created by somebody, or that you could
So
use AI or generative AI to create you. It just provided the attributes, provided some entities, and say, go to town, create me a logical data model. The other aspect of the question, I'm not sure I understand completely, but I think it also had to do with critical data and critical data elements and
yep,
those types of things. So again, when we were talking about the common data matrix, it is a great tool to be able to be used to identify those pieces of data that touch across multiple systems, across multiple domains. So is it important to have a logical data model? I think that will help you potentially to identify those specific pieces of metadata, like what piece of data is critical within your data asset inventory. It's the idea
mhm,
of the data asset inventory is to, boy, this is going to sound like a cheeseburger definition, is to inventory your data assets. It's not necessarily to go into the level of depth that the full data catalog does, but it's
sure.
certainly an aspect of the metadata in the data catalog, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. And Bob, I would think that from a perspective of a logical data model, it might give us an opportunity to capture some things that we want some consistency of definition around as we're maybe launching our catalog or launching an inventory. Like these
That
are
what data
key.
models are for?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Well,
right. It would actually help you to build clarity around those things.
I think so, and be able to communicate what people could expect out of it. I think
Yep.
that's why I love these questions because there was a lot of depth there that we could that we could dig
Right.
into.
Right.
I think we have time for one more here. Uh, What definition of data asset do you use? How do you identify, prioritize and classify data assets?
Oh, I
Um,
did I did provide a definition of a data asset earlier in the webinar. I think it was within the first half dozen slides when I got into into the definitions. Actually, to be able to answer that question, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder because it's going to be what are the important data assets to you in your organization. And whether those things are spreadsheets or they're just systems or they're emails or those are a determination that needs to be made by each company or each organization, I won't say company, as they're building out their data asset inventory. But again, it's a good question, but go back to
Wonderful.
the slides earlier in the webinar to say, how do I determine what the appropriate assets are to inventory?
Yeah, Bob, this is one area where I like to talk about, a data element or a data asset being critical to enacting a business goal or objective. Like
Yep,
where the business is actually trying to accomplish something, what's the data behind that? Well, that's clearly what the critical thing is, right?
yep,
Yeah.
very good.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Bob. This webinar was fantastic, as always. That's all we have time for. Everybody, I encourage you to check out the recordings afterwards. Check out the deck afterwards, and you can review. And we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Bob.
All right, thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure working with you.